Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the meeting of the Development Control and Regulatory Board, which is taking place in the Council Chamber at County Hall, Glenfield. Though some officers will be joining online via Microsoft Teams, this is a public meeting and is being broadcast to the public via YouTube. Could I ask those members and officers in the Council Chamber to raise their hands if they wish to speak, and those joining online use Microsoft Teams raised hand function. Thank you. Membership today of the committees. Pam Posnett is substituting for Mr. King. Item number 1 on the agenda is the minutes. Now I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of June 2021 are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed with everyone? Are there any queries? Thank you. Item 2, I have not received any questions from the public. Item 3, I have not received any questions from members. Item 4, there are no urgent items. Item 5 is declarations of interest. It is noted that all members who are also members of parish, town, district, or liaison committees will have a personal interest in those applications which relate to areas covered by those authorities. Are there any further declarations of interest at this time? Looks like no. Thank you. Item 6, I have not received any petitions under Standing Order 35. Moving on to the first of the applications this afternoon. This is an application by Shane Clark, Block B, Old Dalby Business Park, Station Road, Old Dalby. Nick Bowden will present the application. I have no speakers on this, but we have received a note from Joe Orson, the local member. We'll have a highways officer on both the applications, and so I'll turn over to Nick Bowden then, please. Nick, if you can present the case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That was quick. Are you there, Nick?
Yes, all ready to go, Mr. Chairman, at your discretion.
Yeah, if you'd like to do the report then, please.
The application relates to an existing commercial premises within the designated key employment area of Old Dalby Business Park. It proposes the change of use of part of the site, presently used for concrete barrier storage and hire facility, to a 25,000 tonne per annum inert waste recycling facility for construction, demolition and excavation waste. As mentioned, the site is within the Old Dalby Business Park. This comprises a mixture of industrial and commercial uses and a mix of open storage sites, alder brick, built industrial warehouses and more modern concrete and steel structures. Uses on the business park include industrial uses, warehousing and motor vehicle related uses. The industrial estate is set to the east of Old Dalby village itself on the opposing side of the railway line. There are no existing residential properties in close proximity to the application site, with the nearest being slightly over 200 metres to the north. However, an extant but unimplemented outline planning permission exists for the development of 72 houses, which approaches the northeast corner of the application site. I do have an initial slide a little bit later on to show you the layout and proximity of this estate. The site itself is largely open and later hard standing and ruderal vegetation. It has limited features of note and is bounded by a mix of concrete block walling, metal fencing with low-grade vegetation growing amidst this. The site is presently in use as a concrete roadblock storage and hire facility. This is a sui generis use with similar characteristics to B8 storage and distribution. The immediate neighbours around the site are vacant to north and west, a caravan and motorhome storage facility to the south, and warehouse to the east. Roads surround the site on 3 sides, all being known as Weston Road. The site will be divided into 2 separate elements, with the eastern side, within the blue edge, being retained for the concrete block business, whilst the western part will be changed to the waste transfer facility. Access is to be taken from Weston Road on the west side via an existing access and leads to the waste recycling yard with concrete barrier use beyond. The use is expected to generate 4 HGV movements per day, 2 in, 2 out, in 30 to 32 tonnes, 6-wheeled rigid body trucks, delivering on average around 96 tonnes per day to and from the site. These will be routed east and northbound upon exit from the business park towards the A606. The exit to the business park already restricts movements in this direction, and the presence of a low bridge in the opposing direction towards Old Dalby Village effectively ensures this. The hours of use for the process will be 8 AM to 6 PM Monday to Friday and 8 AM to midday Saturday. Although it should be noted that the existing concrete block business does not have any hours of operation restrictions. This slide illustrates the existing storage use of the site looking north along the west side branch of Weston Road. This shows a similar view looking towards the south along the same stretch of Weston Road. And the entrance to the business park is shown here, which is a restricted access area for tenants and visitors to the business park only. And my apologies, I had thought we did have an image of the residential scheme to show you, but it doesn't appear to have carried through, so my apologies for that. Anyway, sorry to continue. The application site is located on a key employment site as defined under the Melton Local Plan. However, it is not an abroad location for a waste facility, nor is it within close proximity of Melton Mowbray, which is the closest urban area or within a major growth area. It therefore does not comply with the Minerals and Waste Plan policies W4 and W5, which seek to locate such uses in these identified areas. This is to concentrate such forms of development close to the sources of waste and minimise longer distance waste movements and disperse development of this type. The applicant identifies that the waste will be sourced from multiple locations across a wider area, including Loughborough, Leicester and Nottingham, areas which could be better served by waste facilities in these locations. The applicant has also identified a shortage of available and suitable sites within Melton Mowbray. However, this notwithstanding, the site remains outside the identified areas for waste transfer. It should nevertheless be recognised that this operation is located on an allocated employment site and does constitute a waste recycling operation. The application site is also located in close proximity to a recently permitted housing site, which was allocated under the Old Dalby Neighbourhood Plan. Although these houses have not been built, the permission remains extant and upon completion will be located in close proximity to the waste transfer station. Maximum noise output from the waste transfer station is projected to be around 87 decibels at source. This would reduce over the approximate 40 metres to the nearest new homes, however is still likely to be in excess of the nominal 55 decibels daytime background noise level. Further, there are concerns regarding the potential for wind-blown dust to impact on the residents of these new homes, particularly during high wind conditions. In other regards, the application is considered to be an acceptable form of development, which would not, other than set out above, impact upon the area. The application is therefore recommended for refusal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Nick. As you'll have already said, there is a note from Joe Orson regarding this application. Open to members then, really. Pam.
I would just like to add to Councillor Orson's comments that I've just been told that we are expecting to be delivered anytime soon from Melton to Melton Borough Council a reserve notice for the planning on that site at Old Dalby.
Thank you, Pam. Michael.
Thank you, Chair. Really, what we saw earlier this morning at the briefing, a very odd place for a residential development that's had permission since 2018. The cynic in me says that'll never be developed as a residential site. It is a key employment site in the Melton Borough Plan, should remain as such. So my question is, when that permission runs out, will the reasons given for refusal stand up should the applicant resubmit it?
Nick, are you able to answer that?
Yes, certainly. The outline planning permission, which was for residential development, has very recently been added to with the submission of a reserve matters application for the remaining elements of that residential development. That application is presently being considered by Melton Council. So they will assess that in accordance with their standard approach and timeframes, etc. However, I will defer to Anthony on this, but my view is that because the applicant has now submitted that reserve matters application, that the outline permission could be considered to remain extant now because of that submission of the reserve matters.
Okay, well, Mr. Phillimore.
Thank you, Chair. I'm never one to not support economic and business development, but I think the point is, as the officer explained, is this an appropriate location for this kind of facility? And it would appear to be against policy, so I'm very happy to support the officer's recommendation to refuse. Thank you, Chair.
You're moving the recommendation, then, Mr. Phillimore. Thank you. Is there a seconder for that? Mr. Allen?
Yeah, I'm happy to
Did
second.
you
the
want to speak,
recommendation.
Mr. Allen?
No, I was just going to second the recommendation.
Or Kevin, did you want? Okay. Anyone else wish to speak now? That looks to me no then. So in that case, we'll move to the vote then, please. It's been proposed and seconded that the application is refused, but in line with officer's recommendations. All those in favour, would you please put your hand up? Okay, thank you. That item is refused then, thank you. Moving on then to item number 8, which is change of use of a dwelling house at Southfield Road, Inkley. I understand this is being presented now by Oliver, is that's correct, Oliver? If you'd like to present the report then, please. We do have a speaker to follow who is speaking for the application, but we'll deal with that when Oliver's finished speaking. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This application relates to a proposed change of use of a dwelling house in Hinckley to a residential children's home to provide 3 placements for over 16-year-olds in Leicestershire. The application site is on the north of Southfield Road within the urban area of Hinckley, but outside the town centre. This slide indicates the red line application area for the proposed development. The site is located in a residential area of Hinckley, with residential properties directly adjoining to the north, east and west. The application site is accessed via Southfield Road, immediately adjoining the property to the south. 72 Southfield Road is a 4-bedroomed detached dwelling house. This slide shows the site with respect to adjoining properties to the east and west and the shared driveway with the neighbouring property, number 74, to the west, which you can see the edge of on the left side of this photograph. The applicant seeks to establish a safe, high-quality care environment to support children aged 16 and over. The proposed children's home would provide 3 placements and be staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Whilst the applicant owns the site, should planning permission be granted, it is intended that the children's home would be operated by Bernardo's. The proposal does not seek any external alteration to the built form of the property, such as extensions or additional windows. Several letters of representation were received over the course of the application, comprising 13 objections within the statutory period, in addition to multiple objections and representations at other times. Material planning considerations raised were principle of development, parking and highway safety, housing supply, activity and disturbance, and fear of crime. And these matters have been considered within the assessment provided in the report. Additionally, concerns were raised regarding neighbouring property value and resaleability. These concerns fall outside the matters for consideration as part of this application. Following publication of the report, one representation has been received, as detailed in the addendum, which I understand has been circulated to members. In assessing the proposal, the existing residential use of 72 Southfield Road is relevant, and it's important to note that the principle of this development, the proposed use, C2, be residential in nature. Therefore, the development would be in keeping with the residential status of the surrounding area. Whilst the development would reduce the number of dwellings available, it is deemed this would not significantly affect the housing supply of Hinckley and Bosworth Borough, and the Borough Council has not raised any concerns regarding the loss of property as a dwelling. With regards to parking, 2 on-site parking spaces currently exist at the application site, as shown in this photograph. These comprise 1 space in front of the property and the 1 space in the garage to the rear, both of which the applicant proposes to maintain. No additional parking spaces are proposed, and it's acknowledged that occasional on-road parking may be necessary for visitors. The proposed children's home would be of a relatively small scale, housing a maximum of 3 over 16-year-olds. It's believed unlikely this would result in comings and goings in excess of those which could reasonably be expected at the property as a dwelling, and also the wider residential area. And the local highway authority has advised that the parking situation is acceptable for the proposed development. Representations from the public have raised concern that parking on the highway, be that on the road or on the pavement associated with the proposed development, could be unsafe. The local highway authority acknowledges an existing level of parking on the highway along Southfield Road. This is shown in this slide and the next. The local highways authority also notes that there do not appear to have been any personal injury collisions within the vicinity of the site in the last 5 years, and therefore it appears the existing level of parking on the highway is not unsafe, and for these reasons the impact on highway safety is deemed acceptable. Additionally, the site is in a highly sustainable location and could be accessed by members of staff and visitors via a choice of sustainable transport methods. A number of objections raised concerns around the potential for increased disturbance, public nuisance, and crime. In assessing these issues, the proposed use has the potential to create activity and low-level noise typically associated with a normal residential use. Given no proposed increase in bedrooms, it cannot be assumed that residents or staff at this property would generate any more noise than if the property were occupied as a dwelling. With regard to fear of crime, proposals for C2 care homes are not uncommon nationally, with planning decisions relating to similar proposals concluding that it cannot be assumed that children living in care would be more likely to behave antisocially. It is important to note that children living in care homes are cared for by specialist supervising staff who are trained to deal with situations that might arise. Additionally, fear of crime should only be considered a material planning consideration in cases where evidence exists that the associated development would likely increase crime. No evidence submitted as part of this application indicates that crime might increase should the development be permitted. The Leicestershire Police Designing Out Crime team has been consulted. No comments have been received on the application. Overall, the fear of crime does not weigh against this proposed development. So in conclusion, it's considered that the proposal would be appropriate for the location and would not result in significant adverse impact upon the amenity of residents, safety of the highway or local housing supply. And the proposed development is recommended for approval, subject to conditions set out in Appendix A. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you for the detailed report. As I said, we have a speaker this afternoon on this item, Mr. Alan Civita. Are you here, Mr.? Yeah. You have, or you've been allotted 5 minutes to maximum to support your case. So begin when you're ready, please. Ewan will time you and tell you when to stop talking.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alan Silverton and I work for Pegasus Group. I'm here today as an agent acting on behalf of the applicant, Leicestershire County Council's Children's Service Department. The proposed development will provide a home that provides a transition between a children's home and supported living accommodation for children and young people who are in or have finished their GCSE year. The proposal meets the priorities set out in the county's Children and Family Services Department Plan 2020 to 2023, which seeks to ensure that the county has sufficient good quality placements to meet children's needs through establishing provision which will support children and young people. The scheme will provide improved well-being of potential users who will not have to move away from the existing support networks in Leicestershire. Currently, 12 of 20 placement providers for children of 16 and 17 years age that Leicestershire County Council have are located outside of the county. The distance between Leicestershire County Council offices and these out-of-county placements often reduce the frequency and consistency of support, as LCC staff are unable to make regular visits to children and young people in placements due to distance and travel time. Where these visits take place, this comes at a significant cost in terms of travel costs and in some cases overnight stays. The proposal will provide Leicestershire County Council with significant efficiency savings. The management of the property and services offered is overseen by the provider, which in this case is Barnardo's, and forms part of an existing service level agreement between the provider and the council. It should be noted that Barnardo's were awarded the Children's Innovation Partnership contract from Leicestershire County Council's Children and Family Service Department in December 2018 for a period of up to 10 years. This partnership between LCC and Barnardo's covers the whole system, from the point of entry into children's services through to them leaving care. It brings together the council's skills and expertise with those of a key partner to design and deliver support for vulnerable children and families. Barnardo's are considered by Leicestershire County Council as an appropriate provider to deliver and manage the operation of children and family facilities in the county. The development itself is sustainably located on the edge of Hinckley Town Centre and provides links to sustainable forms of transport, including bus, travel, walking and cycling, to access services and facilities in Hinckley and further afield. The scheme will not have an adverse material impact on the highway network with the intensification of the use, and the development also maintains an appropriate number of on-site car parking spaces using the existing access from Southfield Road into the development. The proposed use is residential in nature, and the amenity of residents in the surrounding area will be unaffected by the development. There are no technical objections to the proposals from any of the statutory consultees. It's important to emphasise that no objections have been received on highways grounds or from Hinckley and Bosworth's planning and environmental health teams in relation to the development proposal. In summary, this proposal will deliver a much needed home and service to meet the specific requirements of the county. The proposal constitutes sustainable development both economically, socially and environmentally. It satisfies the aims of the Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council Development Plan and the overarching themes contained within the National Planning Framework. And it is therefore respectfully requested that you accept your officer's recommendation and grant planning permission today.
Thank you, Mr. Civita. What I'm going to do now is, if you just stay in the seat for a moment, is ask any member if they have any questions on what you've just said. So any members, any questions for Mr. Civita? No, that looks like you're out of that one then. Okay. Open to members then, please. Mr. Allen.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. I've read through the representations put forward by Councillor Bray, we have a number of such facilities throughout Hinckley and Bosworth, admittedly not run by Barnardo's, a number of which have some significant issues. I wonder if it's possible to tie any subsequent approval for this application to Barnardo's. So if at some point in the future they decide to change supplier, it comes back to this council for consideration. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Something that I have forgotten to mention was that the comments from Mr. Bray, which you will all have received via email, which I hope everybody's read and digested. Anyone else wish to speak? Mr. Bannister.
Thank you, Chairman. I just have a couple of questions which I hope Oliver might be able to answer for me.
Yeah.
Question one is in relation to the off-road parking, and there's reference to parking available within the garage at the property. Looking at the photograph of the front elevation, I did wonder whether or not there's available space for off-road parking at the front of the property, and if so, for 1 or 2 cars. And secondly, I do think that it is commendable that the council does look to accommodate vulnerable young people within the county as opposed to outside of the county if at all possible. I understand the reasons for better social interaction, costings and so forth. But is that necessarily a planning consideration that this board should have consideration for? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Oliver, are you able to answer that, or does that need to be passed on to highways?
Thank you very much, Chair. So in regard to the first point in the parking, there are 2 spaces. And yes, one of the parking spaces is the garage, which is accessed by a shared driveway with the adjoining property. And the second is the parking space that's directly to the front of the property. It's a parking space, a single parking space. So the availability for 1 car to park there perpendicular to the house, so side to side on essentially, rather than kind of facing the property. In terms of the second point and the fact that this would be providing a local facility for the needs of local residents, it is a matter that has been taken into account in the application, and it does help to justify a facility in this location, essentially providing meeting the needs of local residents. So it weighs in favour of this application.
Okay, Mr. Anderson. Yeah, Mr. Phillimore.
Thank you, Chair. Very short and quick, really. Related to bullet point 17, which is the LHA comment about conditioning parking arrangements, and then point 44. It's to do with the parking, Oliver, so you don't need to chase it too deep. I think this is an interesting one because the LHA have asked for a condition on that parking and you've declined it as a planning officer. But I think that we've got to deal with the reality of the application that, yes, it is a residential facility, but it also encompasses people's place of work, as in the carers. So I actually don't see why we shouldn't be conditioning that the staff should park off street in those 2 spaces wherever possible. I really don't see why we shouldn't. It is a place of work as well as a residential facility. And if it was an employment site, we would expect the employers to park their cars on the site, would we not? I think there is justification, Mr. Chairman, that we do have a condition 4 that conditions staff to park off street whenever possible on those spaces. Thank you, Chair.
Oliver, can you respond?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll respond to that, and then I might bring Nick in afterwards if he wants to add anything. No, I completely I see your point, and it is absolutely is a place of residence and a place of work. I think one of the key things to remember is about the enforceability of conditions, and one of the tests that has to be met when placing conditions on is making sure that they are enforceable. And I think there's possibly question marks around whether we would be able to take enforcement action if a condition was not specific enough, such as saying parking off site where possible. I think there's also potentially question marks around whether we could distinguish between a member of staff's car and a visitor's car, or potentially other people along that street that we do know to visit other houses and park along that street. So I think that's some of the issues that we could run into in relation to a condition like that.
Chairman, do you mind if I just add to that? And just to say, very much agree with Oliver's assessment of that. And the enforcement side of things will be very tricky, distinguishing between different vehicles. I think the other thing is to note that the amount of traffic generated by this use would be significantly different to what the existing use is in place, and therefore the existing use of that property as a dwelling could generate traffic that we're not able to control. So it's a difficult one. Clearly, it's a matter for the committee as to whether they feel that would be appropriate, but I would share Oliver's reservations about enforcement. Just while I'm speaking, if we can come back to Mr. Allen's comments about a suggestion that he made about whether the management control of the facility could be linked to Barnardo's in accordance with the arrangements the County Council as applicant has got in place. I would be very concerned by that. We would have to have strong evidence to say that this facility could not be operated, managed by another operator rather than Barnardo's, so such as the County Council themselves, to justify why we would have to put that type of restriction in place. So my feeling is that that wouldn't be something we could justify. We don't have the evidence to link it to say that only Barnardo's could be the operator that could provide the management that is required to make this an effectively operated premises. So again, I don't think that would meet tests in terms of what we need to assess in terms of the condition. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Nick. Did you want to come back, Mr. Cullimore?
If I may, Chair, because what I'm not hearing is the justification for not conditioning it. You know, the LHA at point 17 has clearly asked for a condition on that parking. We as the planning authority or the planning officers have recommended or suggested that it's not necessary. I think, you know, the point about enforceability, yes, conditions always need to be reasonable, justifiable and enforceable. I've got all that. But if we don't start off somewhere, then we have no control. And if this was an industrial build, we would, a workplace, which it is a workplace or a place of work, we would be expecting and requiring there to be on-site parking for the staff. So I understand Oliver's point, the officer's point about how we would word it, got that. But the starting point surely is the planning application is to repurpose this property for a very important service. There are 2 parking spaces clearly available. Why would we not condition staff to park on those spaces at the outset of that planning approval? I just don't understand it. The enforcement side is always a secondary consideration. We're all aware, I'm sure as members of this committee, that there are lots and lots and lots of traffic offences and condition offences that are not enforced. That does not justify not putting the condition in the first place. So I'm sorry, I refer back. I would like to see a condition that conditions staff specifically to make use of the off-street parking at all times is maybe a bit more complicated, but that would certainly be where I think we should start. And I refer back to point 17. The Highway Authority is a distinct and very important service. Has asked for that condition to be put in place in the first place. So I don't understand why we would not fulfil and seek to fulfil the request from the LHA for something that we can do as a planning authority. So I come back to the chair. I think that condition should be there. Thank you.
Nick.
Chairman, thank you. If I could just come back on that. The requirement for enforceability is a legal test. It's set in statute, and we have to comply with legal tests before we put any planning conditions on. The risk is that if we apply a condition that doesn't meet those tests, we stand the risk of that being challenged either by appeal or we won't be able to enforce, and then we raise expectations with the local community that we can't comply with. Sorry, the other point I wanted to raise was the distinction between the Highway Authority and ourselves as local planning authority. The Highway Authority will provide advice to us on what measures they feel is appropriate to control the highway safety impacts. Ourselves as local planning authority have to balance that against other factors, including the legal requirements and the tests that we have to comply with when applying conditions. So there's a subtle difference between our roles. That's not to say that the Highway Authority wouldn't take into account those matters, but it's for us as decision maker, we're making recommendations to you to go through that process carefully and to thoroughly look at the legal tests as to whether they comply. And in this case, we don't believe it does. Ultimately, it's a matter for you as DCRB to make that judgment, but I would just put the strong health warning on that we would have a very difficult challenge in terms of defending either an appeal or an application that subsequently came in, or a pressure from a local resident or the group to enforce a condition where we don't have the evidence to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. This is right.
Yes, in general, I'm supportive of the application subject to the conditions. Obviously, we need these type of services in the county. My concern, though, is the conditions and the enforceability of the conditions. And I think if the residents were sitting here, their main fear would be that the 3 16-plus-year-olds would be the thin end of a wedge to many more potential residents in that area. So based on that, what reassurance can you give this committee that it will be 3 16-year-olds? And if there is going to be any further residents there, that there'd be an appropriate system and process in place to make sure that it doesn't suddenly turn from 3 to 30, and then we really do have an issue.
Chair, happy to come back on that one. There is a condition that we recommend in number 3 to say that no more than 3 16-plus-year-olds. So that includes people aged 16 or obviously older than that as well. Should be resident at the site at any one time. So it would be fairly clear and obvious, I think, if we had more than that, either from complaints from local residents or through our routine monitoring of the site. And if that's the case, we absolutely could enforce that. That would be a breach of the planning permission, and we could enforce that through breach of condition. So there's various ways that could be raised and brought to our attention, and we absolutely could enforce that if that applies.
You content with that, Mrs. Wright?
Well, not really. That wasn't really my point. My point was, if 2 years from now, if we grant this application, 2 years from now, is it going to be far easier for the applicant to come back to us and say, well, we've had no more than 3 here, but now we want 6, and is that all right? That's really what I'm getting at, because I think that's going to be the fears of the residents.
Yeah, sorry, I understand the question. Clearly, the planning system allows for an applicant to come back to vary a condition, and that could happen at any time with any permission, with any condition we apply. That doesn't mean to say we have to approve that planning permission. We would assess it on its merits like we would do with any development against normal planning policies and other considerations that we take into account. And it would be in the gift of of this committee to refuse planning permission if there are sound planning reasons to do so. So if that situation did apply, we could refuse in that situation. So that it does not open the door to other planning applications or make it easier to increase the numbers just because this planning permission would be granted, if that's what your question sort of suggests.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Allen?
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to come back in support of Councillor Phillimore. I wouldn't have thought it was beyond the wit of man to devise some kind of system where staff members' cars are identified, some form of pass or something. And just because it's difficult doesn't mean to say we shouldn't do it. So I would support a condition as described. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Mr. Lovegrove?
Thank you, Chairman. Mine is also on the car parking and the shared driveway. I see that the property is a Leicestershire County Council owned property, so that I'm sure there would be a legal agreement on the shared driveway anyway for equal access and maintenance of that driveway. But it is on parking and it is a place of work for the people who will be working there. And looking at the age of the house, I would presume the garage is the same age. And I would think 90% of garages don't have cars in. Lawnmowers, ladders, etc., etc. And also the size of modern cars, you might get the car in, but you might not be able to get out of the car. So I wouldn't say that was a legitimate parking space. It might be a case of taking the garage down and creating a flat area where 1 or 2 cars might park on tarmacked area and reduce the size of the garden somewhat. But that'd be a concern of mine, that there's actually only one legitimate parking space.
Okay. Is there anyone wanting, Mr. Phillimore?
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on Amanda's point, condition 3 officers, because this application is on behalf of the CYPS. All it says is 16 plus. 98-year-old would be 16 plus. So should that actually have that upper limit as far as our corporate parenting level is, which is 25? Just the question. So, 16 plus is very broad.
Chair, there's no reason in planning terms why it couldn't be someone of any age over the age of 16. In planning terms, it's no different impacts in terms of, all the issues that Oliver discussed in his presentation earlier. So I think that's why the conditions worded that way. With your permission, Chair, I was going to make a suggestion about the car parking situation as well. The suggestion about a condition, there's obviously different ways we could word a condition. If the requirement was to retain space for 2 vehicles to park off the highway, I think that would be a much more enforceable proposition than if it's something that's linked to the staff themselves. And just picking up Mr. Allen's comments about understanding what the vehicle registration numbers of the staff are. If it was just to require that space is kept available for 2 vehicles to park off the highway, I don't see that being a problem. And I think actually that's probably what Mr. Hunt from the Highway Authority would require anyway. With your permission, I was going to ask Mr. Hunt whether or not that is what it's okay.
Right. Hi, Nick. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's what the Highway Authority would advise, that they retain the 2 parking spaces in perpetuity, no different to a residential property, and appreciate Councillor Phillimore's approach that it is a place of work. But I think if we had a condition that satisfied retaining those two parking spaces, we'd be happy with that, and we'd take county planning colleagues' advice on that as well. So,
okay, thank you, Mr. Michael. You're waiting patiently.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I've no real issues with the principle of it. I've had 3 of these applications in Oadby and Wigston to deal with, 2 of which quite a while ago, and there's been absolutely no issues. They've never come back for extra spaces. They're all dwelling houses and they've got capacity, and I suspect this is at its capacity unless they have an extension on it. I've only known of one incident in these 3 care homes where a member of staff was assaulted. I mean, these are troubled. Some of these teenagers are troubled, but that was dealt with appropriately. No broader issues to speak of. But all those, it's process. All those applications were dealt with at borough level. I'm curious why this is here. I know it's an LCC property, but originally it went to Hinkley and Bosworth Council and was decided in May. Why is it then coming here for another decision? I don't understand that. Could somebody explain?
Nick or Oliver?
Can't comment on the earlier application without checking the detail of that, but this is a Regulation 3 application, what's known as Regulation 3 application. So where we are the applicant, landowner, the application must come to ourselves. Now, whether an application was submitted in a different person's name, perhaps that might have been why it went to Hinkley and Bosworth Borough Council. It's difficult to say without checking into the detail, but it certainly is an application that should come to us.
If I could come back, Chair, I mean, I've got the application in front of me. Exactly the same recommendation, description here, change of use, dwelling house C3 to C2 for over 16s. Status decided on the 28th of May this year. As for a name, I couldn't tell you, but the reference is an LCC reference. And it was decided. The decision was recommendation only. I don't know what that means. There must have been a recommendation, but they've not put it down here. So I just think we're double dealing here.
All right.
Hi, Chair. Can I respond to that if that's okay, Chair?
Yes.
Oliver here. I think what might be what you might be looking at on the Hinkley and Bosworth Borough Council website is a consultation response to us. As part of this application, we've obviously consulted them, and they have responded to us without any objection to it. And I understand that they report their consultation responses on their website. So it's possible that their consultation response to this is appearing as perhaps an approval or a no objection, and that's why it's got the same reference and the same address.
Sorry, once again, Chair. So there was no problem at Hinkley and Bosworth Council for this to go ahead.
Yeah, that's correct, and the consultation responses are summarised within this report, and Hinkley and Bosworth had no objection to this proposal.
Okay, Mr. Bannister.
Thank you, Chairman. I just would like to make comment about the discussions concerning the condition, a possible condition regarding the off-road parking to be confined only to members of staff who are working there. My view is that may well be too restrictive because it presupposes that the members of staff have a car and will be travelling by car and will be parking there. I appreciate that there's a train station nearby and this is very close to a bus route. And if it were the case that a member of staff was using public transport and we had a condition that the off-road parking could only be used by members of staff, it would mean that one or possibly even two off-road car parking spaces would not be utilised. I prefer the condition, if we were going to go down conditioning, is simply to allow for two off-road parking spaces to be made available. This is not beyond the possibility that one of the residents might actually have a car and might want to use one of the spaces available. So I don't particularly want to see this becoming too restrictive, Chairman. Thank you.
Nick or Oliver, any comments on what Mr. Mann?
Yeah, sorry, just on that point, I think that's absolutely right. I would agree with that. The key point about restricting, the parking situation is to make sure that the spaces are available for vehicles to park. It shouldn't really matter whether it's staff, visitors, residents who are parking on those spaces. If there's space available, it's better they park off street rather than on the pavement or elsewhere on the highway that might cause, obstruction of safety problem. So I'm happy with the general one. We use those sorts of conditions all the time. And if members are minded to agree, we could, delegate the wording of that, so we could come up with our standard wording that controls it in that way.
Come back, Mark, and then I think we're perhaps looking for.
Just briefly on the parking issue. I mean, neither of them are particularly conducive to easy parking. One's a garage with a door, which you've got to drive into and reverse out of a driveway, a shared driveway, which we don't want blocking at all. And the one at the front, you cannot park straight on. It is not wide enough for that parking. It is parallel parking only with that place. And that takes some reasonable driving, I would suggest. So whilst we would like them to be used, I think members of staff may find the road a lot easier to use.
Okay. Anybody else like to perhaps move something that we can, Mr. Fillion?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm happy to accept the officer's recommendation with the addition of condition 4 as suggested by Nick, that just has that capture everything bit, but is non-specific, just which also satisfies the LHA as in perpetuity. So happy to move that with the addition of condition 4, please.
Thank you, Mr. Fillimore. Seconder for that? Kevin. Did you want to speak, Kevin? No. Okay, move to the vote then. All in favour of Mr. Fillimore's proposition? All in favour? And show, please. Thank you very much. Moving on then to all in favour. Sorry?
Everybody was in thing, just say all against us to make.
Oh, okay. Yes, I do apologise. I didn't take the anyone against. Is there anyone against it? Finners are all for it. Okay. Item number 9 then is a verbal update on a planning application which was in February. I mean, most people here won't know anything about it because it wasn't here then. There was only probably 3 or 4 of us, I think, that was here. Anyway, I'll hand over to Nick Thomas and Anthony Cross to provide a verbal update on that planning application, where it's going or where it's finished with. Nick.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, apologies you don't have any papers related to this. We thought it would be helpful to provide a verbal update about a planning application that was considered by DCRB in February this year, on the 11th of February, where you considered, or those of you who are part of DCRB at the time, considered a planning application for the erection of poultry units and for an anaerobic digestion facility at a site in Beeby, Manor Farm, Beeby. And that planning application was granted by DCRB members subject to a resolution where you had conditions and a Section 106 agreement. And that Section 106 agreement was signed on that, I believe it was the 18th of June when the planning permission was granted. Since that permission was granted, what happens is people have the right at that stage, which is very rare actually, a very unusual situation. People have the right to submit a judicial review and go to the High Court and challenge the decision that the County Council has made. So very rarely, and this is the first time I've known it for many, many years, we did have a member of the public who did seek legal advice and subsequently informed us that they would be challenging the County Council's decision in the High Court. And that challenge, as we were informed, related to the quality of the applicant's submission in relation to the environmental statement so the environmental impact assessment has to be carried out. And specifically, they raised concerns about odour, air emissions and flies from the development. And they also highlighted other issues, including concerns about the officer report, which those of you on DCRB will recall was quite a detailed and lengthy report and quite a complex proposal to assess. But concerns were raised that the report was not thorough enough in respect of the assessment of that detailed consideration and the impacts, environmental impacts in relation to the spreading of manure on surrounding fields. As happens in this type of situation, we're very much up against the clock, and there's no time to sort of report back to members. We need to make decisions very quickly because the costs can mount up very, very quickly in these situations. We sought legal advice from Council in order to see whether or not there was any merit in us defending the case in court, or whether we should concede to the judgment and agree to the quashing of the permission. The advice that we received was that the case would not be strong and that we wouldn't have a very, very good case to defend the claim in court. Therefore, we were strongly advised that it would be in our interest to concede and accept that the planning permission should be quashed and redetermined. As I say, these claims are governed by strict timescales. They're very rare, and we have to respond very promptly, and that's why we had literally had a very short time period in which to respond and to make that decision. But the costs can accumulate considerably into situations where even a few weeks are delayed, but while we decide what we want to do. So we agreed and we conceded to the judgment, and the court has agreed in line with the wording that we had agreed. And on the 13th of August, the planning permission was quashed. We didn't have a DCRB in August, so this is the first time we've had the chance to brief you about this. But as part of that order, we have agreed to pay the claimant's costs, and in this case, it was just over £10,000. That included their costs plus the legal court fees that's associated with this process. Had we either took longer to make that decision or this was considered in court, that would have increased substantially. Very, very expensive, as I'm sure you'd be aware, in terms of the legal costs. We have received comments from Mr. Galton, who unfortunately found out that this situation had arisen from local residents. So we hadn't told him, so that's a mistake on our behalf, and we'll certainly learn from that for the future. I think that was partly to do with having no DCRB and partly because we had to respond very quickly. So we hold our hands up there, and that's something to learn from the future if we ever get a situation like this again. The next stage, now that the permission is quashed, is that we will need to redetermine the application. So the application comes back to us, the status moves back to undetermined, and we will need to reconsider the application afresh. It's likely that we'll be going back to the applicant and asking them to revisit their environmental statement. They'll need to update that and address the concerns and the issues that were raised as part of the legal challenge. And then that will be subject to some sort of a formal statutory consultation process, so the residents and consultees will be given the opportunity to comment. Once we've gone through the process of assessing the application, which is likely to be a number of months' time, we will bring a report back to yourselves, DCRB, to make a decision afresh without taking into account the previous decision. You'll consider it afresh based on the evidence that's in front of you and the report that we present. It's likely that we will be seeking Council's opinion on any subsequent report, but we'll make that judgment a bit nearer the time. So that's all I want to say, just an update really as to where we are with that one. Some of you may be already aware of this situation that's occurred, but yeah, happy to answer any questions. I don't know if Anthony wanted to add anything to that, Chairman.
Thank you, Nick. Mr. Cross, did you want to add anything to?
Well, only briefly, thanks to Nick for that outline. I think for the purposes of open committee, I'm a bit limited what I can say, but I think what I should say is that when the letter came in from the solicitors who are acting for the applicant in this judicial review case, it was someone who hadn't, in a sense, been on the radar. The issues that had been concerning local residents was about lorry routing. So quite a lot of effort and time was put into ensuring that the planning agreement that was completed in June dealt with those issues. And in fact, we actually also went to get the council's opinion just to make sure what we were putting in, because it's quite robust, was lawful, and that was confirmed. I think the issue also was compounded by the fact that there was a very similar case on its facts that had been decided by the High Court involving Shropshire Council about a year or so previously. Very similar facts where the court had had a contested case, so they'd heard all the arguments, but had ruled against Shropshire Council. Now, on that basis, that meant there was some precedent, and certainly from our perspective internally, and indeed from Council, that weighed very heavily. So we were up against it significantly. So the right decision was to concede the case at the earliest possible opportunity, so as to minimise the County Council's costs. And as Nick said, they're a respectable £10,000 or so. If we'd have been and had a day's case in the High Court, we'd have been talking about for our own costs, something in the region of about £10,000 to £15,000 on top. So it was the right decision. We've certainly learned from it in terms of how we do these type of things, and a lot of it comes to the environmental statement that's produced by an applicant. And I think we've picked up some things that we will be doing differently as a result when we come to do this the next time around. Mr. Galton was in touch with me also about this, about concern the fact that he hadn't been made aware. Nick said so. Apologies that we didn't do it correctly. The mechanics are, though, matters when it comes to legal issues are delegated to the Director of Law and Governance, who then carries out matters in the best way she thinks is appropriate. Happy to take any further questions, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. Mr. Phillimore.
I don't know how we can actually, how or if we can do this, Nick, but you quite correctly inform members that when the next application comes forward, it will be determined on its own merits and its own basis. But, you know, I, for one, am definitely not a technical expert in environmental issues and those areas. So is there any way, without putting bias on the next report, that we can be flagged as to these are the areas we really need to be very focused on? Thanks, Chair.
Yeah.
I think, as you would expect, we would be looking in any subsequent report that comes back to you to make sure that we absolutely thoroughly address the concerns and issues that have been raised as part of the legal challenge, and also any additional issues that arise as part of updating the environmental statement, additional representations from consultees and from members of the public, and that will be clearly set out in the report. But as I've said before as well, we'll take advice legally in terms of the report to make sure that it's structured in a way so that's clear and understood, because we do recognise that members aren't going to be experts in environmental impact assessments. They're complex at the best of times, but certainly in situations like this. So we will absolutely guide you the best we possibly can.
Okay. There's no further questions. We'll move on to item number 10 then. As I've already said, there are no urgent items. Item 11 is Chairman's announcement. The only announcement I have to make is that the next meeting is scheduled for the 14th of October at 2 p.m. And with that, I'll close the meeting. Thank you very much.